You don't need to learn MVC frameworks. I already taught it to you. And because my students are brilliant, you didn't even realize how smart you are. What are MVC frameworks? Well, MVC is an abbreviation for Model View Controller, and a framework is nothing more than a design philosophy. Now, you know how I often complain about how stupid these supposedly genius computer nerds are? Well, okay, here's a story for you. Back in 1998, my good friend Mike Rozak and I invented MVC frameworks all on our own. As we were developing numerous websites and constructing databases and using include files and creating blocks of code to reuse, we began to notice a pattern. There were certain ways to structure the code that just made a lot of sense. We would build a form page, the controller, to update a database. We would build a page, the view, to display information. And then we would build a separate page, the model, to process the form that interacted with the database. Now, back then, if you were to research how to do this work on the internet, most forums and developers would do all of that coding on a single page. But that was stupid. We learned right away their suggestions were messy and confusing and made for web pages that were far too complicated. Why were they building websites in such ignorant ways? Our methodologies were far superior. Now, we didn't have nerdy names for this structure. We didn't call it an MVC framework. We just built everything that way because it was logical, because it was sensible. So around 10 years later, in maybe 2008 or so, other web developers finally started to catch up and figure out maybe they should compartmentalize their code this way. Naturally, they took it 5 steps too far, made it overly complicated, and began to package these pre-built libraries and structures of code as MVC frameworks. Some popular ones go by names like Laravel, Zend, Symfony, CodeIgniter. Oh, and by the way, these frameworks typically require a dedicated server. You can't learn frameworks on a shared web host because the core functionality of PHP is frequently altered. So using these pre-built frameworks is never a very user-friendly system. Now, at the core of this framework's philosophy is simply the idea of making logical structures in your code and reusing functions and features you have already written, which, as I said at the beginning, is what any smart developer does, right from the moment they start to learn how to program. One of my very first interviews as a developer in California, I had a team of developers scrutinize me with utter disbelief, and they asked, "So you never went to college?" I said, "No, sir." "And you wrote all this code on your own?" I said, "Yes, sir." And then some developers kind of scoffed incredulously, and I was like, "Why do you ask?" And they said, "Well, because self-taught developers never write code this clean. Only people who go to school learn how to do this. So it's just hard to believe you didn't go to school, but you wrote this code." And I said, "Oh, well, I did." I didn't get that job because I think they assumed I was lying. In other words, if you follow the guidelines I have shown you in these videos, you are already creating MVC frameworks on your own. You have sensible directory structures. You comment your code and compartmentalize it so you can reuse old code snippets in new projects. Through sheer experience, you create your own frameworks. MVC frameworks are nothing more than templates of pre-written libraries and pre-made file structures. Are there ever times when an MVC framework marketed by other people could be useful? Yeah, potentially. I mean, let's say, for example, you're building a complicated e-commerce website with all kinds of order tracking and fulfillment and live inventory updates and things like that, That type of website would be extremely complicated and time-consuming to build from scratch. So it might benefit you to use some templates and frameworks to help you connect that stuff together and create the site in 2 months instead of 6 months. But if you're building a website to promote an independent musician or show off a photography portfolio or promote grandma's brownie making business, you don't need to use MVC frameworks built by other people, okay? That would be like hiring a construction company to build a backyard treehouse. You could do that, but you'd be kind of a loser, okay? Build a treehouse yourself. Leave the construction company to the skyscrapers. And remember, kids, the world owes you nothing until you create things of value.